Okay, Blake, this week we're going to start a series on nuclear accidents with the most well known nuclear accident, Chernobyl.
That's a good nuclear accident.
It's the favorite nuclear accident of everyone. It's kind of a gift that keeps on giving.
If I had to make a top 10 list, it'd be at the top.
So I'm going to try to build up a model here of how a nuclear reactor works and explain as much as I need to in order to get that across. They're pretty complicated, and there's a lot of positive and negative feedback loops that work while a reactor is in operation. And controlling a nuclear reactor is a balancing act of all these positive and negative feedback loops. It's very much different than other types of reactors. If you imagine something like a natural gas turbine reactor, where you're just simply burning natural gas to spin a turbine to generate electricity, that's very easy to control. You just throttle the natural gas going into the turbine, and that's most of the control that you have over it. It's not very much more complicated than that. Now, with a nuclear reactor, you have this fuel that sits inside the reactor, and it's typically uranium or plutonium, and it's of some grade, so it's a certain purity.
Sometimes it's plutonium.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, in some generation 4 reactors.
Hmm.
So when we talk about the purity of nuclear reactor fuel, what we're talking about is the ratio of different isotopes. And if you all, of course, remember your chemistry 1 class in college, your isotopes are versions of an element that have a different number of neutrons to them. Now, we define an element by the number of protons that it has. And so if you imagine this cluster of protons and neutrons in the core of some atom of something, if we simply add another proton, then we call it something different.
Okay.
If we add another neutron, we instead say it is the same element. It is still carbon, or it is still uranium, for instance, but we append a number to it. And so the number is the number of neutrons. And all of these isotopes will have wildly different characteristics. And so some of them will break down naturally through radioactive decay, giving off neutrons and giving off heat. Some are very stable. Most of the ones that you encounter in day-to-day life are very stable. That's how you end up encountering them. They're not radiating away. Some radiate away.
Maybe this is off topic, but why do atoms decay?
Because the nuclei are unbalanced in certain ways. Because of the number of protons and neutrons, because of the weak and strong nuclear force, because of electromagnetic force between the nucleus and the electrons surrounding it. Because of these different things, you may have stable or unstable isotopes.
Okay.
You can also get a graduate degree in physics if you want to know more, because it's a very complicated topic.
Okay, I might skip that.
Yeah, I skipped it too. I tried for about 2 weeks and then quit.
I'll just ask my co-host on the Fungineering podcast, and if he doesn't know, then I'm done.
So again, we're talking about fueling a nuclear reactor with fuel of a certain grade, meaning it contains a certain percentage of isotopes that we're interested in. And so commonly that's uranium. And so natural uranium will contain a majority of one isotope and a very, very small minority of another isotope. Now, if you remember from our nuclear weapons podcast, there's great effort that goes in with nuclear weapon making to isolate that rare isotope and get it as pure as possible. With nuclear reactors, depending on the design you're using, you may not have to purify it at all. And in the case of Chernobyl, that was the requirement of the fuel, that it not be purified at all. It was not necessary. And so they could go and they could mine uranium, and they could get the uranium out of the rest of the rock and the ore. But as long as they came to the reactor with just uranium, they weren't concerned about what the isotope makeup was.
Huh.
And when the Russians designed this reactor class, of which the Chernobyl reactors belong to, their goals were to make very powerful, very simple reactors that could be mass produced. Now, mass produced for this means, we can build 100 of them, maybe. It's not excessively expensive to build them. It's not excessively complicated, even though it's a nuclear reactor. But they were looking for a reactor design that would be simple enough to replicate a lot to take care of their energy needs. So a reactor that does not require a large degree of refinement of the fuel is very good to that end.
Yeah, I had no idea they used just unpurified uranium. So that means it was
Yeah,
like, it's less than 1% U-235, right?
right. It is 0.7% U-235, which is what you desire for nuclear weapons.
Wow. Yeah, that saves so much money on the most expensive part of the process.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And if you want to get net energy out of a nuclear reactor, that helps you a lot.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
So in general, how a nuclear reactor works is you take this fuel and you put it in water, and the fuel will undergo spontaneous radioactive decay of the uranium. And when that happens, it releases some neutrons. Now, those neutrons can do a couple things. They may sail right out of the system, because you can imagine a neutron as this tiny little particle, and it goes flying off in a random direction from this nucleus when it is shed during a radioactive decay event. And in order to not fly out of the reactor, it has to hit something else. It has to hit another nucleus. But, when a nucleus is very small in relation to the size of an atom. And the analogy that they used to teach us in school, since we grew up in Houston, was if you were sitting in the Astrodome and the whole Astrodome was an atom, the nucleus would be the size of a pea placed in the center of the field. And so as your neutron that's escaped is sailing past atom and atom and atom and atom, it's trying to hit one of those little peas. And if it doesn't, it'll fly out of the system. Now, the way you try to ensure that it hits one of those is you use things that are very dense, things that have a lot of atoms in a small volume. So you want to capture that neutron so it stays in the system. Because one of the things you hope that neutron does is strike another atom of uranium. And if it strikes another atom of uranium just right, it will split that atom. And so what comes off is, I believe, an atom of cesium and an atom of iodine, I think, are the two elements that commonly decay from a uranium. And if that happens, you get a special bonus. You get several neutrons out of that splitting of that atom. And now you can see that if you get several neutrons out, you can create a chain reaction here where you've split one atom, you get several neutrons, and as long as at least one of those goes on to split another uranium atom, you get more neutrons, and this goes on. Now, also, when you split that atom into those two other elements, they had a lot of energy in them. They started vibrating very fast when that happened. And so there was a lot of energy that was previously contained in the bonds of that uranium atom that is now free. And that manifests as kinetic energy and friction. And so if you have this uranium fuel sitting in water, as this happens, you will heat up the water. And you can probably see where that goes. The way most power plants work is we burn something to heat water, to make steam, to power a turbine, to create electricity. So with a nuclear reactor, it gets more and more complicated on top of this level. So you have a class of materials called moderators. And typically you'll use graphite. So what a moderator does is it hopes that a neutron will hit it, and it is unlikely to absorb the neutron when it gets hit, and it is unlikely to be split by the neutron. But what it will do is take some of the energy out of the neutron. And the reason you want this to happen is that when that neutron bounces off of a moderator like graphite, it's been slowed down a little. And if it then comes into contact with a uranium and strikes it, it's much, much more likely to split that uranium. Because when a neutron hits an atom, there's a chance that it'll split it, and there's a chance that the neutron will be captured by the atom. So if it's been moderated by a moderating material, it'll slow down and be more likely to split the next thing it hits.
So if a neutron hits like a U-235 or U-238 atom and it's going really fast, it'll turn it into like a U-236 or 239?
There's a chance of that, yes.
Aren't those really unstable though? Don't they then decay into some other product really fast?
Yes, but they will decay and just release some neutrons, maybe release a little bit of heat. What you really want is for them to strike just right and split that atom, because the energy that was formerly contained in the bond between the two product elements is what you really want, because that's a lot more energy.
Oh, okay. So they would just absorb the neutron and then re-radiate it, and that's not very interesting.
Right.
Okay.
So that's why you have these class of materials that are called moderators.
I always thought a moderator like absorbed neutrons and inhibited the reaction.
So that's another class of materials sometimes called inhibitors and sometimes called poisons. I think there's a distinction between that, in that poisons are typically byproducts of nuclear reactions that build up inside a nuclear reactor, where a inhibitor is something that you've built into the design. So a common inhibitor will be boron, and it will absorb neutrons and basically not re-radiate them.
Where did they go?
I don't know. I think it just gets hot. I don't know.
It seems like you'd end up with radioactive boron, right? I don't know.
You could, I guess. I mean, it could be contaminated.
Sure.
So you end up with these absorbers. In the case of some of the poisons, when they absorb a neutron, they just turn into the next isotope, and they have new properties. Like they may become very stable and not release the neutron. So when you're building your reactor, when you're designing it, you're balancing these things out. What grade is my fuel? How often will it release neutrons? How much moderator do I have, and how likely are neutrons to encounter that moderator? What kind of inhibitors do I have that will absorb neutrons? What byproducts of the nuclear fission reactions act themselves as poisons, which will absorb neutrons and slow down the reaction? And this is where you start to get into some of these positive and negative feedback loops, depending on the design. And it's important to note that water is a very good moderator. It'll slow down neutrons, but it's also a neutron absorber, and it's used as a coolant. And so water is this really great material to use inside a reactor for several purposes. Now, this class of reactor that the Russians were using or the Soviets really, were using at Chernobyl it used graphite as a moderator, and then it used water as a coolant that it would pump through the core. And then you have this huge containment vessel around that. So you need quite a lot of water running through the core to keep these cooling rods cool. And this type of reactor would run about 12 million gallons per hour of water through the core. The core contained 1,600 rods of fuel, which were several meters long. I think they were 3 or 4 meters long. And they were in this very complicated configuration with something called a control rod. And so what a control rod is a movable rod that comes up and down, in and out of the core. So you have all of these vertically placed parallel fuel rods, but then at certain spots in between them, you have your control rods. And the control rods are made out of a neutron inhibitor, so that it'll grab these neutrons and slow down the reaction. So if you can imagine that you have this chain reaction of fission going on, and you have all these neutrons flying around in your core, and then you have these rods that you can adjust up and down. As you push those rods further down into the core, they will have more opportunity to absorb neutrons and slow down the reaction. And so placement of the control rods is one of the main things that's used to control the power output of a nuclear reactor.
Why are there so many rods? Like 1,600 seems like a lot.
Yeah, it's because you need to make sure that, well, let's imagine you just had one rod. It's going to be very hard to get a lot of interactions, right? When you put out a neutron, only neutrons that you put out longitudinally have a chance to strike another uranium. But if you have two rods now parallel near each other, there's a small chance that when one puts one out, it'll be pointed towards the other rod and it can hit it.
Yeah, but why don't I just have like 100 rods or something like that? Like not even that many.
Because you need to increase the chance of collisions by having more and more and more parallel rods. So that if you're at any point in the reactor and you look around in all directions, you want to see rods everywhere, ideally. The ideal reactor would probably be an infinite number of parallel, infinitely long rods, because then every neutron would eventually strike something inside the reactor, either a moderator or fuel or a control rod.
Huh, okay. And then I guess a rod's just the easiest shape to machine it into. Because it seems like flat plates would work pretty well too.
Yeah. I wonder if they build flat plate reactors. I don't know.
Okay, so 1,600 rods maybe it sounds complicated, but that's like a simple way to get the right result.
Yes.
Okay.
You're just trying to increase the chance that any neutron that comes out, for any of the reasons that neutrons can be emitted, will strike another uranium. That's what you'd like.
Okay.
Okay. So then you have these control rods, and they can be moved up and down. And again, they're made out of a neutron absorber. And I guess the last fundamental thing to know is there's this procedure called scramming a reactor. And during a scram, what you do is you insert all the control rods all the way. And the idea is you want to stop the reaction as fast as you can. So it will poison the reactor. And what that means is it builds up some decay products that will inhibit restarting the reactor for about 20 hours or so. And this is one of those cases where a nuclear reactor differs a lot from other traditional types of power generation in that you can get your reactor into a state where it can take over a day to restart it. You can't just restart because you have so much poison built up in the reactor. And that was part of what caused the Chernobyl accident. So the Chernobyl power plant had 4 reactors at this time, and there were 2 more under construction. And they had taken this reactor number 4, which is the one where the accident happened. They had taken it down for some maintenance, and they were bringing it back up, and they wanted to perform a test. So forcing the water through the reactor itself takes quite a bit of power. But nuclear reactors and other power reactors don't always power themselves. So they generate very high voltages, but those voltages then have to be stepped down to be usable. And all that equipment to step the voltage down is not always located on site. And so very commonly you have power plants that have big power lines going away and small power lines coming back to power equipment. And so the tests that they wanted to run involved cutting the power and disabling the steam from reaching the power turbine. And so what they wanted to see is, will these emergency systems come online fast enough to keep everything running, to keep the water pumps running? Will the diesel generators come online fast enough to power the water pumps? And will all of this work and keep the reaction under control so that if we have this kind of failure, the thing won't melt down? And they had tried this test several times in the years before and always failed it. So they had tried it 3 previous times. But there was a lot of pressure to get this test done. They knew it was kind of a safety problem for the reactor design and for the plant. And so they wanted to get this test done.
What's it mean to fail this test? It's just not fast enough to come online?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the diesel generators that would take over pumping water through the reactor took something like 75 seconds or so to come on and come up to peak power output to power these pumps to keep the core from getting too hot.
Why would they take so long?
Because they generated a lot of power to pump that water.
That's because I don't know. I'm just thinking of like diesel engines in cars and trucks, and it's like you can turn them on and then floor it immediately and
Yeah.
get peak power. So I don't understand why the generators would be slow to come up. They have some giant flywheel in them or something?
I don't know.
Okay.
And so what they wanted to see from the test was, as we have this water pumping nominally, if we cut the power to it, will the residual power in the turbine pump pumping water, will that be enough to keep the water going for that period of time while the diesel generators come up to speed?
Okay.
So will the residual energy in that turbine keep the water flowing at a high enough rate? And obviously the danger is if you don't flow enough water through the core, it gets very hot. And this design of reactor had a very fatal problem. It was called a positive void coefficient. And what this means is when you had water going through the reactor, it acted slightly as a moderator, though this design used graphite as its main moderator, but it also acted as a neutron absorber. Now, if the reactor gets too hot and it starts boiling this water, steam takes up about 1,000 times the volume that liquid water does. So now you've made air pockets in your reactor. And those very thin air pockets that don't contain a lot of water no longer absorb neutrons as well as liquid water did. And because of that, your reaction will start to speed up because you're not absorbing those neutrons. So this is a positive feedback loop. Now, there's other types of reactors that have negative void coefficients. So if you start boiling the water, then the reaction actually slows down. And that has to do with the amount of water and using water as the moderator in those other types of reactors instead of using graphite. But in this reactor, you still got moderated by the graphite that was there. So neutrons were still being slowed down enough so they could more efficiently produce new fission reactions, but you were removing the neutron absorbing capability of that water by boiling it into steam. And that would increase the reaction rate.
Was this known and understood at the time they were designing and building the reactor?
Void coefficients were known and understood. It was known and understood that this design had a negative void coefficient. Now, the people doing the test that night were not the right people. So originally the test had been scheduled to happen on the first shift, on the day shift. During the day, though, basically the power authority for the Kiev area, which, Chernobyl is in the northern part of Ukraine, and it's about 65 miles north of Kiev. So the power authority for Kiev called the plant and said, hey, we're having a problem somewhere else. Don't do this test. We need the power from all your reactors, all 4. So they postponed the test. And later in the evening shift, they called back and they said, okay, we're done. You can, use your reactor, do your test. So already the day shift people who had been preparing to execute this test had gone home. And it was late enough in the evening shift that those people were preparing to go home. They only had like an hour left or something in their shift, a very, very short time. So they started trying to get the reactor to the correct conditions to begin the test. And by the time the reactor was ready to go into test, it was into the night shift. And so you had people who had not prepared to run this test. Now, arguably, if you're in the control room of a nuclear reactor, it doesn't matter what time of day it is, you should probably be qualified. But it was just that I don't think it was a lack of qualification any more than anyone else who ever worked in the control room was qualified or unqualified. I think the issue was they just weren't prepared to run this test. They didn't think they were going to have to. They hadn't studied the procedure, and they just hadn't planned on it. So that was the first issue. The second issue is that because this was a test intended to model the system's response to a power failure, no longer driving the water pumps, it was not considered to be a test of the reactor. It was considered to be a maintenance event. And because of that, the people at the power plant did not consult with the company that designed the reactor and send them a test plan and say, do you think this is safe? And I think it was a poor translation, but the physics officer of the power plant was not brought in on it either. So the head science guy who should tell you if it should melt down or not was also not part of this test preparation.
It seems like if you just thought about it a little, though, you would think, hey, we're gonna stop the thing that cools the reactor. Maybe we should ask more people about this.
And initially, according to the test plan, the test was sound.
Okay.
And that's what we'll get into. Spoiler alert, they don't follow the test plan. So also because they're in the night shift and it's after midnight when this test finally begins, the chief engineer of the plant is not there. He's at home asleep. So basically, all the people who might have been authorities and normally should have done something about this were not there. They either weren't informed, they weren't involved, or they were gone for the day because, hey, it's Soviet Russia and my shift's over. Screw you guys. So I guess it was Soviet Ukraine, actually.
I was going to say.
I think they might take great offense to being called Soviet Russia. So they get ready to start this test, and they need to bring the reactor down to a low output, 700 megawatts, in order to begin the test. So they want to have the output low so that they don't really need as much water flowing through the reactor to mediate everything. And as they're doing this, one of the operators makes a mistake, and the power output falls to 30 to 50 megawatts. It craters. Now, something interesting happens. In a nuclear reactor, remember, you're splitting those uraniums into iodine and other elements. Well, there's an isotope of iodine that is the most effective neutron poison in the periodic table and all of the islands of isotopes. And it ends up naturally in your nuclear reactor. Now, if you're running a nuclear reactor at steady state, you'll build up this iodine that is a neutron absorber, and you will burn it off at the same rate, at an equal rate. And so at steady state, you will come to a certain concentration of this iodine. And that works great because over time, you just have a certain amount. You design your reactor so that it can deal with this poison in it. But there's a problem when you lower the power output. As you lower the power output, you're still having some fission reactions going on, generating power and creating new isotopes of this poison. But you don't have enough fission going on, releasing neutrons that burn off this poison. So as you lower the power output of the reactor, you increase the concentration of this poison. So the reactor becomes unstable at low power because you might pull the control rods out a little bit and it starts to build up this poison, and now the power starts to fall much quicker than you intended.
What do you mean by unstable?
If you had a certain rate of reduction of power output relative to a control rod position, you will now increase that at low power. So your rate of reduction of power output will not always be linear to your control rod position.
Okay, so it means you just start getting nonlinear response from your reactor.
Yes.
Okay.
And the flip side of this problem is when you restart a reactor, if it still has a lot of this poison left in it, then initially you have a hard time getting over this poison because it's absorbing neutrons. But once your reaction starts getting going fast enough, it starts to burn off the poison much faster than it's creating new poison. And so on startup, you can have a opposite kind of upwards instability in the rate of increase of power output. Understand?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So that was the situation they found themselves in. An operator made an error, the power level fell, the poison started to build up, the power level fell more, and then they were down at 30 or 40 or 50 megawatts. And the test procedure said they needed to be at 700 megawatts to start the test. And so the guy in charge got irritated at the technicians and he said, just get the power back up. And so they start removing control rods. Now, you can imagine a nuclear reactor responds very quickly. I mean, neutrons are emitted very fast and they're reabsorbed very fast because they travel very fast. And so if a chain reaction gets out of hand, you as a human cannot respond fast enough. And that's why you have computer systems that control the position of the control rods. Well, what they decided to do, because the reactor was now in this low power state, was disable automatic control of the control rods and just remove some of them. And so they started disabling groups of them and removing them all the way manually and leaving them disabled because they wanted to get enough of those neutron inhibitors in the control rods out of the core so a chain reaction could get started again and burn off all the neutron poison that had built up and get back to a power level so they could start this test.
Is that ever a reasonable thing to do?
I bet some people could tell you a time when it's reasonable to put some control rods under manual control, but it should probably be accompanied by its own procedure.
Okay.
Not just fly by the seat of your pants. Let's be Soviet cowboys and let's just do this.
I was wondering if it was going to be one of those things where it was like, why do we even have this button?
Yeah, and I'd say I'm about 40% in that camp. Like maybe it was really stupid to let them control rods at all. But I don't know. I can at least imagine maybe there's some time when it's useful to do for startups or shutdowns, or I mean, if nothing else, if you need to replace the control rod, you need to be able to manually control it and remove it from the core so it can be replaced.
Yeah, that's true.
Maybe that would be the only case. And maybe that functionality should not even be controllable in the control room. Maybe there should be some maintenance control room where you could do that. So I'm not entirely sure the answer to your question. That's my speculation.
Okay.
So they start doing this, and let me think. How does this go? Okay, so they've got the reactor going a little bit, and the guy in charge in the control room has decided that once we get to 200 megawatts, we can start the test. Forget that the procedure says 700. We'll do it at 200 because, you know, it may take a lot longer to get the core to come up to 700. So part of the test procedure says that they were supposed to activate extra water pumps. So they do that, but the core is running at much lower power than the test procedure called for. So when they activate these extra water pumps, they're now pumping too much water through the core. They're not getting enough steam out. And because they're not getting enough steam out of the core, the power level drops again. So they turn off those extra water pumps and they decide to just go on with the test without the extra water pumps that are supposed to be there and at a different power setting than is supposed to be there. So they finally get it stabilized at 200 megawatts, and they're ready to start the test in this bastardized form that they've just kind of pulled out of thin air. So they begin. They cut power to the power turbines. They let them start spinning down, And immediately, as predicted, water flow to the core drops. The diesel generators start trying to come on, get up to speed to produce enough power to power the pumps. But the power in the core starts to run away because, again, as you start generating more power, you burn off that poison faster. And as that poison gets burnt off faster, your reaction runs away faster and faster. And so after about 30 seconds or so, the core is generating too much power. They get scared and the system scrams. Now, there's argument over whether or not the scram was manually activated or the computer activated it. There were still some control rods under automatic computer control. Not all of them. Many of them were locked out and fully retracted. But a scram should insert all of them. Now, a problem happened when they scrammed because of the design of their control rods. It's a two-part problem. One is, for some dumb reason, the tip of their control rods were, instead of being a neutron absorber, were a neutron reflector. Now, it seems really stupid because when you insert the control rods, you want the reaction to slow down. But if you take a neutron reflector and you start sticking more reflectors in the core, you're going to bounce neutrons back at fuel more often and increase the reactions. But that's how these control rods were designed. Like something like 1.5 meters of the tip of the control rod was reflector. So initially, as you start inserting the control rod, your reaction will speed up.
Well, why? Why would they do that?
I would suspect it was so that they could get reactors going faster on startup. You would insert just the tip of the control rod, and you would have extra reflector in there, and that would help you burn off poison faster. So in a controlled startup, that would be useful.
It seems like you should have two kinds of rods then.
Yeah, it seems like, well, one thing they did have is other neutron sources that they could use to help start up a reaction.
That's just a bizarre conflation of things. Like, you have the safety technology that's also sort of your make it more dangerous technology.
Yes. So it was kind of a known concern, but these people on the third shift had not really been briefed about it, and it was found in investigation later that people really didn't have a good enough understanding of the reactor and the physics and everything to be doing something like this, or really even to have the power to do things like this. So when you initially scram the reactor to try to shove all the control rods in and make it safe, it causes the reaction to run away faster because there's a neutron reflecting material on the tip of the control rods. Additionally, these channels that the control rods are going into are obviously they're hollow cylinders that you insert a rod down into. And these cylinders are full of water. And now you're displacing that water also. And that water was acting as an absorber. So now you've displaced absorbing water and you've replaced it with a reflecting material. So you have two things when you first start inserting the control rods that both cause the reaction to speed up. And so the reaction has already started to get away from them because the water flow is too low to cool the reactor enough, and they've removed too many control rods manually. And they've done this test in a configuration where a lot of poison was built up, ready to get burned off and cause the reactor output to increase very quickly. So they've created this incredible confluence of conditions that causes the thing to just run away once they start putting the control rods back in. Additionally, I found out the control rods insert really slowly. It's something like 12 seconds to fully insert the control rods. And I had always thought that control rods, when you scrammed a reactor, they were basically like propelled into the reactor, but in this design, they were not.
Yeah, I thought that too. I thought it was like if you scrammed a reactor, I was thinking it would be under a second to get all the rods all the way in. like they'd be fired as if from a gun.
Yeah, that was not the case. I was very surprised by that. That's very poor design.
It does seem that way.
Because the scram was intended. I mean, there was no purpose for a scram that was not let's shut this down now and get it all the way shut down. I mean, that's the whole point of a scram. It's your emergency abort. And so you would imagine that the rods should be, like you said, fired into the core. Alas, they weren't. When they started inserting the rods, they caused the chain reaction to just go out of control. The next step in the sequence of events is highly debated among physicists because much of the data collection equipment failed at this point from the explosion. There's some physicists who believe that the explosion was very similar to a fizz of a nuclear weapon when you have a improper partial detonation of a nuclear weapon. Some of them believe it was a steam explosion because as the reaction went further and further out of control, essentially all the water being pumped in through the core to cool it all flashed to steam very quickly and caused an explosion. There's debate over that. But essentially, there's a sequence of two explosions several seconds apart. And they blow the 1,200-ton lid of the reactor off the top and out of the building. And fire this graphite cladding material that was in the core all over the place, all up onto the roof of the building and all around the core. The bottom of the core containment area stays intact. But you've had a catastrophic failure. You no longer have water reliably pumping into the core to cool it. And you have essentially it's slightly moderated material, but it did not get the control rods inserted all the way. So there is still some nuclear reaction going on at this point, not as much, but all the material that used to be the core is now molten hot. Most of it is melted. So the fuel, a lot of the graphite, concrete surrounding the core, metal in the core, it's all melted into this lava. And now that you've blown the lid off of the containment vessel, you have air. And you've got air with all this heat, and the graphite catches on fire. So this burning radioactive graphite starts to convect up into the open atmosphere because the roof is blown off the building, and it starts releasing a radioactive cloud of contaminant. Various pieces of material land next door on the roof of reactor number 3. So the fire department comes. There's a local fire department at the power plant. The Pripyat Fire Department responds, which is the town close by where all the people who worked at the plant lived. And even the Kiev Fire Department responds from 65 miles away and drives up there and gets there in time to help fight the fires.
Wow.
So these firefighters who get there, initially, they're not even told that there's a problem with a reactor. They're told that the roof is on fire. And they climb up the ladders and they get on the roof and they start fighting the fire with all this incredibly radioactive material around. And some of the measurements were always inconclusive because there was never good equipment. Typically, people were more interested in trying to solve the situation than take measurements of radiation. But from what measurements exist and the records and analysis by physicists, some places around the plant after the explosion had radiation dosages high enough to kill you in about a minute. And in other places, it was basically benign. It was background level radiation. So it spanned the entire spectrum. And so several of those firefighters ended up dying in the days and weeks afterwards of acute radiation sickness.
And it was just sort of based on where they happened to stand while fighting the fire.
Yeah, and whether they were deployed to the roof of reactor number 3 to fight the fire on the roof, or whether they were deployed into the buildings of reactor number 4. And again, initially the firefighters did not even know there was any radiation hazard at all. They just thought the roof was on fire. An interesting side note is that when the Russians built the reactor, and this was the Russians, not the Ukrainians who built it, the Russians were supposed to build the roofs out of fire retardant material, and they just decided to skip that step. So the roofs of all the reactor buildings were flammable. So now you've got this smoldering lava core of a reactor open to the atmosphere, sucking in air, giving off radioactive dust. So what do? In true Soviet fashion, you denied that it happened. You don't make any statement, and you say that everything is fine. And they kept this up for about 36 hours. And by 36 hours, they already realized, okay, this is really bad. We have an exposed nuclear reactor core that's belching radioactive dust. We have guys who are already showing acute radiation sickness. And we've got a town just a couple miles away with, I believe, 49,000 people lived in Pripyat. And so they decide, okay, we'll go ahead and evacuate them. And everything goes great. They're actually able to evacuate them very easily because they lie to them and they say, hey, you just got to leave for a couple days. Look, just take like 2 days of clothes and that's it. You'll be coming back. So people don't pack much and they don't panic. So they all get on the buses and they leave, never to return. They realize they need to get any reaction that is still going on in the core under control. And they have no idea what's happening in the core because it's a smoldering mess. So they think about how can we do this, and they decide we need to throw stuff into the core to subdue the reaction. So they get a whole bunch of essentially borax, like you use in laundry detergent, is a really good one because boron is a really good neutron absorber. They use a lot of clay. They use lead ingots because the lead is very dense and will block neutrons, and the lead will melt and seep into any cracks. So it can get into hard to reach places to stop any reaction that may be going on. And they drop a lot of sand also. So they realize how desperate this situation is over about the next 8 or 9 days. They realize they need a lot of helicopters dropping this material into the exposed core. So they actually recall Soviet military pilots from Afghanistan, where they're fighting the war in Afghanistan at the time. They recall them to Chernobyl to fly their helicopters and drop stuff. And all those pilots get just terrific doses of radiation because they're flying around in the radioactive cloud that's coming up from the open reactor.
I'm surprised that they considered it a high enough priority that they would recall them from Afghanistan.
So part of the reason is that they were afraid there was going to be another explosion. The reason they thought this is that underneath the reactor, you have a floor, and underneath that, you have 3 sublevels. So the top of those 3 sublevels is essentially a steam containment. And the intent of this is that if you have a leak in a lot of the steam piping, it's going through that level. So if there's a leak, the steam will leak into there. The 2 sublevels below that steam containment are bubbler pools. Now, if there's a steam leak in that top of the 3 levels, it'll be routed down below those bubbler pools. And the bubbler pools are used to let the steam flow through them and cool off and condense. So that if you start leaking steam, it's not just going everywhere in a factory because, or a power plant, because steam is highly corrosive and very dangerous and everything. So they have this containment system that will protect a lot of the steam piping. Now, this whole containment system, these 3 sublevels, had filled up with water. One, because the reactor broke and all of the cooling water that should normally be flowing was spilled. But 2, the firefighters got there, and for a while they tried to actually fight the blaze of the reactor, and then they were like, fuck this. But all 3 of those sublevels were flooded. Above those sublevels, you had a concrete floor, and right above that, you had the concrete containment of the reactor. And right above, sitting on that concrete level, was this molten material, this molten fuel, graphite, metal, molten concrete mixture. And it was still at 1200 degrees C, they estimate. And what they were worried about was the concrete containment cracking, releasing it onto the floor, and then that cracking and releasing it down into that pool of water below. So now you would have had several hundred tons of essentially radioactive lava that would fall into giant pools of water and cause a much greater steam explosion than the initial reactor explosion. And that's what they were afraid of.
Okay.
And I saw various estimates. I was a bit skeptical. One of the estimates I saw said that they thought that explosion could be like 100 times the Hiroshima bomb. And I was like, it's just steam, and it's like going to be contained 3 levels underground. And I don't know. I was a little skeptical, but
Yeah, that seems really unlikely to me, because as we talked about in the nuclear weapons podcast, the real difficulty of getting a high yield out of radioactive material is keeping it all together long enough that a lot of it fizzes. And this had no containment keeping it together.
right, but this was not going to be a fission reaction. It was simply going to be lava dropping into a giant pool of water.
Yeah, but there's no way to put 100 times the Hiroshima bomb of energy into water without blowing something up that's 100 times the Hiroshima bomb.
Yeah, and I felt that they said that line at the beginning of one of the documentaries I watched, and I was like, you're just trying to lure me in, so I keep watching this.
Yeah, that sounds like some kind of linear calculation where they're just like, oh, there's 100 times the radioactive material available, or something like that.
Right. And the fear was if you got this steam explosion, then all of that radioactive material would be ejected. And Lord knows, what size of particle it would be, how high in the atmosphere it would go, how far it would go. And there's a lot of the material. I mean, it was much more than what was belching out of the plant just from the fire that was still going on. So they decide that they need to get that water out of there. So a couple of guys put on wetsuits and respirators, and they go wading in the water because, of course, there's no way to drain the water remotely. There's no valve you can open remotely. There's no local valve that can be operated remotely. You have to send guys into the knee-deep radioactive water to open the sluice valves, the sluice gates, to drain the water out. So a couple guys volunteer. They go in there, and they live. The popular legend is that all 3 of them died that night, but there's a researcher who wrote a book about the disaster in 2006, and he found all 3 of the guys. So they go in, they open the sluice gates, and then the firefighters are able to pump out the water then. So they alleviate that disaster. They think, okay, it's not going to suddenly collapse now. But it could still melt through the containment, melt through the floor, melt through the 3 sublevels, and start melting essentially down through the dirt. And underneath the power plant is an aquifer. And that aquifer drains into the Dnieper River. I think it's pronounced Dnieper. It drains into that river, which is a major river in Ukraine that runs from Belarus in the north all the way through Ukraine to the Black Sea. And so Chernobyl is in the north of Ukraine. So it would have allowed all this radioactive material into the Dnieper River, going all the way south through Ukraine, through Kiev, and into the Black Sea. And so that became kind of the immediate focus then. And they said, how can we shore up this foundation and these sublevels? So they said, well, the best thing to do is bring in a whole bunch of miners, have them dig a tunnel, dig under the foundation, dig a giant room, build a liquid nitrogen refrigeration plant, and freeze the ground. What could go wrong? So they bring in these miners.
That still doesn't seem like it could work. That's like cold is anti-hot, right? But it's like
Yeah.
uranium can produce so much more heat than you can remove by liquefying nitrogen.
Yeah. But they need to shore up the foundations, and part of it was, let's shore up the foundations against, the essentially the explosion, the trauma of the explosion and everything that's happened here, and let's get this stuff just stabilized. So they bring in these miners, they start digging this tunnel to reach under the reactor, and they eventually get under these sublevels and they dig out this big room to place this refrigeration equipment. And so they bring in the stuff, they calculate they'll need this ungodly daily volume of liquid nitrogen to keep the ground frozen at minus 100 C. Very ambitious. So they do that for a couple days and then they're like, man, this is not going to work. So they end up just filling that whole huge room with concrete to basically make like a secondary foundation under the whole reactor. Much better idea. Because then this lava would have to essentially melt through all of that, which is highly unlikely. So it's probably not going to get to this aquifer. So this goes on and on. They decide we need to clean up as much of this radioactive dust that was spit out on the local town. They send guys into there to basically scrape the dirt off the ground. They dig giant ditches around the plant, the power plant, and they bury this dirt. They pick up any waste, any pieces of the core they can. They bury it in these ditches. They try to just bury as much as they can on site. And so it's ultimately believed that very little of this material that they dropped into the core, all of this sand and borax and lead and everything, actually had any real effect. They think very little of it actually got close enough to the core, and they think most of the debris on top of the core was basically keeping that material from getting in. They eventually get the fire to basically go out. Now, remember this molten fuel and this, it's called corium. It's not really reacting still efficiently enough to keep itself hot. It's just very hot residually from the meltdown event. And so over time, it cools down and it solidifies. And once that happens, they really have a handle on the situation. Then it's about containment and about cleanup. It's no longer about this immediately deadly radioactive fire. And they decide, what's the best thing we can do? We'll hastily construct a concrete and steel building over the whole reactor, and it'll be good for 30 years, because I guess the world will stop existing after 30 years. We'll never need to worry about this again. So this will be a great solution. And it becomes known as the sarcophagus, and it's this ugly steel and concrete structure. And it ended up leaking like crazy. The main point of the sarcophagus was to keep weather erosion from damaging the building and the core anymore, and to keep water from flowing into the core and then like washing out radioactive dust and stuff like that into the surrounding land. So they build this thing, and it lasts, it's still there today, but it did develop severe leaks over time and all kinds of problems. In 2010, I believe, they started building a more permanent structure, which is basically a giant arch that they built next to the reactor and had on rails that they could slide over it. And it's this huge structure. It's like, I want to say it's like 200 meters tall, something like that. It's just enormous. And it's designed so that they could, in theory, completely disassemble the entire power plant out from under it. So it's just an arch that spans it without being supported by anything in the power plant.
Does it completely enclose it?
Yeah, it's closed on both ends.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And it's designed to withstand like an F3 tornado. And I don't know how many tornadoes they get in Ukraine, but
I think some.
more than one.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the other places in the world besides the central US that gets tornadoes. There's only a few places.
I've never heard of that.
Hmm.
So an interesting topic that comes up with the Chernobyl disaster is how many people died. And really it was incredibly few. It seems that basically 2 people died in the initial explosion and fire. About 30 died of initial radiation exposure in the cleanup, and an enormous number of people were brought in from all over the Soviet Union for this cleanup. Over 500,000 people participated in the cleanup at the power plant. A lot of the reason for that is that workers would come in and within a reasonably short time, they would receive their lifetime dosage of radiation and they'd be sent away. So you had to keep cycling in new workers. There was a helicopter crash during the initial attempts to drop material into the core that killed 4 people. But early on, the number of people who died was very small. There's a lot of disagreement over what the increased death rate from extra cancers and other diseases due to the radiation will be. And the more or less official number is that it'll be about 4,000 or so additional deaths. Now, there are some groups who estimate up to 1 million, but if you go look at their websites and how they feel about nuclear power, you can see that they probably have a conflict of interest that influences those estimates. It's interesting because epidemiologists have attempted studies at this, and it's difficult because the Soviets didn't keep good records because it was embarrassing and they didn't care. The Ukrainians were hamstrung because they did not operate the power plant. The Russians operated the power plant. And also the victims or really the people who came to the factory to work on the cleanup, they were from all over the Soviet Union. So you have all the people are just dispersed over what is now all of these independent nations again. So it's very hard to do good studies. One epidemiologist who did some work on it contests that all of the people who were moved out of this ever increasing exclusion zone that they established around the plant would have been better off just staying where they were. That the additional background radiation from the contamination of the soil from the disaster was less lethal over the course of your lifetime than being moved to Kiev and living in the air pollution of the giant city.
Wow.
Now, this is there are highly localized effects though. So depending on the wind patterns in the days while the core was still burning, some areas are worse than others. And depending on the runoff patterns after rains, because you may have a large area that gets a higher dose of radioactive dust, but then also because of runoff, it gets concentrated somewhere else. And so there are places that are very deadly, but in aggregate, most of those people who were moved away are more unsafe for being moved to a smog-ridden city than they were in the radioactive countryside.
So maybe they should have just moved temporarily, like was initially told to them.
Yeah, I think there was no appreciation of that effect back then.
Yeah, probably.
And there are also widely debated ways of measuring radiation and its effect on mortality. So people get into a lot of arguments of that. Some people just want to measure like how many sieverts of radiation were released and then try to just divide that by a number needed to kill a man. And then they're like, that's how many people die.
Yeah.
And that's a very poor model. A better model is how many were released? What do we think the average dosage for a person in some area was? What do we know about that average dosage's ability to produce additional cancers? And what is the death rate from those cancers? And then how does that also factor into the age composition of people living in the area? Things like that. So the models of how radiation exposure affect your lifespan are just all over the place. And that's part of why you end up with some of these estimates that 1 million additional people will die because of the disaster.
It couldn't have been anywhere near as deadly as US above ground nuclear testing was.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you've already made fun of the Russians for a lot of the things that they did wrong. But is there anything else that they could have done to prevent this?
They had a bad design. They knew it was unsafe after the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Some reports were released, and they had known as early as like 10 years before that this reactor design had some very bad safety problems that could manifest under the right conditions. And some of them manifested in this test. So you had a bad design, you had insufficient training, you had people who were willing to go off of the test plan because they didn't understand the dangers. You know, you had the classic confluence of the machine and the people and the right event, and you had a disaster, which is typically what you need. Very rarely do you find big disasters without all three of those things.
I wonder if some of the people there just thought, no way can this explode.
Yeah, they all had a sense that it was much safer than it actually was.
Like, oh, it'll automatically scram if anything goes wrong, and that'll prevent anything, or something like that.
Right. Or there's no way it'll run away so fast.
Yeah.
Other than the design being known to be unsafe, I mean, that's the big thing that the Russians were guilty of in this. And they built something like, I want to say it was 40 of these reactors. I think there are still 11 in operation today. After the accident, the reactors 1 through 3 at Chernobyl kept operating for quite a while. Reactors 5 and 6 that were under construction when the accident happened were canceled. By 2006, I believe, all 3 of those other reactors at Chernobyl had been shut down. But today there are still 11 of that design in operation. Now, they were changed after Chernobyl to fix some of these problems. For instance, there's no longer a neutron reflector on the tip of the control rods.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. But, you know, one of the things that struck me in this was the fact that the people in the control room were willing to go off of the test procedure. And that's really the closest cause to the accident. It's that there was a test plan, and the reports that were done afterwards really absolved the test plan. They said if they had followed it, it would have been fine. It was a solid test plan. It was safe. But they made several changes on the fly without competent people who could judge the possible effects of those changes.
Yeah, it seems really weird to, I don't know the right word for it. I guess like customize the test plan on the fly, like just sort of guess when you're controlling a nuclear reactor.
Right.
Like you wouldn't expect people to do it in an airplane or a space vehicle, or I don't know. It's really weird.
Yeah. When I had that first job at NASA, I was in for about 9 months, and I did the environmental testing stuff. When they needed to do something like that, the test director had to approve it, and then the engineers who had built the apparatus or whatever was being tested all had to sign off, and then the quality guy had to sign off. And then if the change in the test affected something like a pressurized system, then a pressure systems engineer had to sign off. And so you ended up with this long list of people who could be held accountable if they made the wrong decision. And so you were at least asking those people to evaluate this change to the test plan.
Yeah, but you were doing that in the 2000s in America.
Right. I wasn't worried about being sent to Siberia, which one of the things I read said that was influencing one of the guys. Like, he was afraid of being sent to Siberia if he lost his job. And working as a technician in a nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union at that time was a very prestigious and well-paying job. And there was a lot of competition for it. So all those guys in the control room had a lot of, I guess, perverse incentives to make bad choices.
That explains a lot. So it was more important that they say we completed the test than we did a safe and reasonable test.
Yeah. And again, this test had been attempted several times in the years before. It had been delayed. This opportunity to run the test had already been delayed a couple times, and then it had been delayed that day. And there was huge pressure to get the test run.
Okay. Now it feels like it's all falling into place. So once again, we see people don't build organizations where the incentives flow down to perform the correct action.
Yeah.
That seems to be the common theme of all the accidents.
Yeah. How do you do that? You get a ruble for every gigawatt hour that the power plant safely produces.
You have a pension that collects and is instantly just like removed if there's ever a critical accident at the plant. So everyone has their lifetime pension riding on the line.
Yeah.
And so everyone's like, no way am I losing my pension. I'm not going to approve that change to the test plan.
Yeah. Then they'll just change the definition of what a critical accident is. Speaking of that, the Ukrainian government did that. So after the reactor meltdown and explosion, and it's belching this radioactive dust everywhere, a lot of it landed in the watershed of this large lake that was one of the bigger water reservoirs for Ukraine. And specifically, it fed Kiev. And the authorities saw that the radiation level in the water was rising. So they just raised the limit at which they said it's still safe to drink. And then it just stayed safe. Yeah.
Wow.
It got too high, like a month or so later. It got above that again. And they just kind of quietly changed the source of Kiev's water from the Dnieper River to some other river that flows near Kiev.
So they just temporarily dosed the entire city with extra radiation in their water.
Who knows? I mean, I didn't look through at the exact levels and then go and like reference that XKCD comic to see if it's actually dangerous. But
comparing everything to bananas.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That's the thing that people get, I think, irrationally hung up on about nuclear power and nuclear stuff in general, but especially nuclear power, and most consequentially, nuclear power. It's, oh my God, the radiation. XKCD had this comic many years ago after the Fukushima accident where they actually showed like relative doses of radiation from different things. And the lowest dosage was you eat a banana. And a banana contains potassium, of which there are several isotopes that are naturally occurring. And so when you eat a banana, the potassium gets inside you and it irradiates you a little bit. But it's a ridiculously small amount. It's it's so tiny that you could eat like 1,000 bananas a day for the rest of your life and you'd never have a problem.
Well, your life would only be one day long if you ate 1,000 bananas.
But the potassium wouldn't kill you.
It's a lifetime supply.
But the point is that we can measure radiation at much, much lower levels than are dangerous. Even than are dangerous to be exposed to every day for the course of your whole life.
I think it's just really hard to reason about the danger of radiation levels.
Yeah.
Because we know that it's harmful in certain circumstances. Like, X-rays are a little bad for you, right? You wear a lead thing. I mean, probably. Mary Curie died.
You have your placebo cover they put over you at the dentist, and then they just proceed to irradiate your brain.
Yeah.
Over and over and over.
It depends on the angle, but yeah.
It's pretty close.
Yeah. But we know Mary Curie died from radium, although radium's way more radioactive. There's other stuff that's happened from radium. All the TSA agents are going to start getting cancer from airport scanners.
I'd say good, except I'll end up having to pay for their health care.
Yeah. Well, also some of them are just doing a job and they don't understand the consequences.
Yeah. Live by the nudie scanner, die by the nudie scanner.
So what state is Chernobyl in now?
The core of the reactor solidified again. This corium lava material solidified. There's discussion among physicists over what happens to that material. Apparently, when you have nuclear reactions going on, material can kind of crumble apart like dust because you're splitting atoms into other atoms and it breaks bonds between them. It breaks, the higher physical bonds that hold things together. And so they're worried that this corium material will eventually turn into a very fine powder and become harder to contain. Most of it is in the basement of the building, though. And they think that that is structurally very sound. If they left it there, it would take like 1,000 years or so to get to the point where you could start sending people in to remove things. I think with the new cover that's over the building, the plan is probably something more along the lines of we'll just do small remediation over time and keep everything stable, and we'll hope in the future there's better technology and they can deal with it.
Yeah, that'll probably work.
Yeah, I mean, if the site is geologically stable, it's seismically stable, as long as no one shoots like a big missile into it, it'll probably be okay.
Could you just pour a huge amount of concrete over it?
Yeah, if you cleared away enough of the surrounding building. Yeah. You could just build a huge concrete retaining wall and then fill it.
So it's pretty much stable now.
Yeah, it's I don't think there's any risk of it spilling into the aquifer that's underneath. I think that's far enough away and they've fixed up that risk to take it off the table. So but it's really interesting that, so few people died. The land seems to be fairly usable. There's not like huge swaths that are just desolate now because all the plants are so irradiated or anything. There was something interesting I read, which was some parts of Germany got a lot of the fallout from this because of the way the winds were blowing and things. And every year there are about 1,000 hogs that are hunted in Germany. And apparently, if you kill a hog while you're hunting in Germany, somebody's got to hit it with a Geiger counter to see how radioactive it is because of this. And so every year, about 1,000 of them are radioactive enough that they don't let you eat them.
What do you do with them?
I don't know.
I don't know how to safely dispose of a radioactive hog corpse.
I guess just bury it.
Yeah, I guess so. I was going to say burn it, but that seems worse.
You certainly don't want to cremate it.
Feed it to 2 other hogs, and then you have half the radiation.
So there are still some residual effects like that, but I was surprised in my reading about this of how innocuous the entire thing turned out to be in terms of number of deaths. I mean, it was really bad, and the Soviets didn't help things. Like I said, the Russians ran the power plant, and they didn't even tell the government in Kiev what had happened for like a day and a half. They were just like, oh yeah, there's just been an accident, it's no big deal. And they weren't telling the local state government that this was a much bigger problem.
Yeah, that is a pretty, I guess, inadvertently and on purpose well mitigated failure. You would think if your reactor literally explodes that it would be worse than it ended up being. And I didn't know it was that mild, I guess. I thought it was worse than that.
Yeah, like a lot of material was released and a lot of radiation, but it seems like the overall consequences of it from here on out are not really going to be that big. I mean, I guess if you're one of those 4,000 people who are going to die, it's a big deal for you because you lose some of your life. But what we've suffered in exchange is squashing nuclear power. And how many more people will die because of what we used for power besides nuclear in the 30 years since this?
Probably a lot more.
Yeah. when people are able to argue that being relocated to a big city like Kiev is more dangerous than living among the radiation, then it makes you appreciate what the future might have been if we had had unlimited electric power from lots of nuclear reactors and we weren't driving a bunch of cars still burning gasoline and things like that now.
It would have looked more like France.
The French government was really interesting in this. They basically denied forever that they got any radiation from this, despite it being measured all over their country and the weather patterns of the days after the explosion, showing that they obviously got a huge cloud of radioactive dust all the way from Ukraine. They've just basically denied it forever. I think they just don't want to have to pay disability claims based on it.
Oh, okay. I was thinking it was trying to defend nuclear power in that country.
Oh, that's probably it too. They're one of the biggest nuclear power producers.
Yes. I think they're the biggest per capita in the world.
Yeah. In Ukraine, 5% of the population is on special disability because of Chernobyl. They get payments from the government because of their injuries.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's suspiciously high. I wonder how you get that. Like, how could the government possibly disprove it? You're like, I taste metal in my mouth all the time. And they're like, I don't know how to disprove that.
Maybe you go to the doctor and he Geiger counters you and you have to hit a certain threshold.
No, because you could be exposed to radiation, but not have radioactive particles inside you. So certainly what you said is a way, but it wouldn't cover everyone.
I know, I'm saying it'd be a good test for the government to apply.
One of the ways they actually do this is they look at how many genetic mutations your kids have if you had kids before and after the accident. They compare the number of genetic mutations that the kids have.
How do you do that with technology from before 2000?
You don't. They can only do that now.
Oh, okay.
Because I guess you have to sequence the entire genome to do that. Because you have to find you have to do both parents and then both kids. And then you have to do all the comparison to see what the mutations actually are.
Yeah, that's non-trivial.
It's easier to just pay the fraudsters. It's a real mess for some of the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. I read that in the Baltic states, Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, it's a real problem because they had a bunch of citizens who were sent to Chernobyl to help with the cleanup. And they have a lot of sick citizens now, and it's a real burden on their government to try and pay for their health care and their ongoing treatment for these things. Because those are just small countries that, they're not that rich or anything, but they were given this huge burden by the Soviets.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's just a real shame that the perception of this accident is so much worse than it actually is. Because I would love nothing more than for us to have lots more nuclear reactors. And we've got really great designs that people have come up with that we're not building.
Maybe one day.
Yeah.
Or maybe we'll just go to solar.
Yeah. Oh man, we need to do an episode on the Ivanpah facility in California.
Okay. What is that?
That's a solar thermal power plant using molten salt and focused sunlight.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah. Is there anything more you want to know about Chernobyl?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay.